Welcome back to another APUS History video lecture. This time we're going to be taking a look at the National Review for Period 5. So this period covers probably about 1850 to 1875, and in many ways the best way to see the commonality here is that it's a lost opportunity for solving the problems of slavery. Slavery posed a huge problem as an institution, not only for what it was doing to the country, but also what it would do to the community of African Americans and the effects afterwards. There were a number of huge opportunities here for the U.S. to solve that problem. The big problem is, not only is the U.S. going to have a failure to compromise leading up to the Civil War, but then afterwards with the period of Reconstruction, the United States really does not find a way to bring African Americans into the country equally and solve the effects of what had been done during slavery. Now remember, the South tried to secede in order to form their own slave agricultural republic. The North, on the other hand, was attempting to form a centralized government with an industrial center and free labor. In the post-Civil War period, there was an attempt to unite the country around free labor and some sense of unity, but that period known as Reconstruction really ends up being that lost opportunity. So here's my thesis. The Civil War period really is a lost opportunity, not only to bring the country together in unity, but more important, to solve the racial problem of equality, and that's going to leave us with some really long-term effects of inequalities the country is dealing with ever since. So we're going to start off with the Civil War itself. In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, but the problem was the Democrats had put up three different candidates: Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell. Now, they weren't really all Democrats. They actually split up into different factions and different parties, but they kind of fit under the Democratic idea underneath the South of having states' rights, agriculture, and slavery. Right after Abraham Lincoln won, pretty quickly, within about a month, all of the southern states started to secede one at a time. And even though there is that argument out there that maybe there are some other reasons why they decided to secede, it's pretty clear they actually said it in their secessionary documents. They were seceding over the issue of slavery. In fact, all of them said they were doing that except for one, and that one particular state said they were seceding because of slavery and to keep a racial hierarchy, and they used some other language that I'm not going to use in this particular case for that. So when the Civil War gets started, the Northern strategy was that they had a unified national army, they had a navy that could blockade the South, they had what was called the Anaconda strategy, kind of like the anaconda snake. They were going to go in and basically strangle the southern transportation in the Mississippi River. If they could just cut off that southern half of the Mississippi, it would basically destroy the southern transportation ability. And then the other big thing was to keep the Europeans, especially England, out of the war. On the southern side, the strategy was to just defend their territory. They were hoping they could get the British involved, to get materials from the British, and that would kind of break up the North and the South. And then their other thing was that they just had better generals. Overall, their generals like Stonewall Jackson and like Lee, all of those were just excellent generals and had a much better ability than the Northern generals did. So the other thing the South tried to do was just to drag on the war until basically the North would get fatigued, and that almost worked. The war went from 1861 all the way out until 1864. At that point, Abraham Lincoln was getting a little afraid. He was afraid he was going to lose the election against a general who had fought for the North, but had been fired by Abraham Lincoln. David McClellan, he ran for what are called the Peace Democrats. And it looked like the election was going to be close. Abraham Lincoln got pretty afraid. For Abraham Lincoln's sake, however, it became very clear afterwards that he trounced David McClellan in that war. That allowed for Abraham Lincoln to do a few different things. First off, after the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg, Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, typically in our sort of mythology, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves. It really didn't. The 13th Amendment did. Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation basically to free slaves in the Deep South. Of course, that didn't happen because Abraham Lincoln had no power over the Deep South at that point. But his point was, number one, to cause chaos in the South, and number two, to say that this war now was a war against slavery. So he made it into a moral crusade. That really did help out because what it made sure was that England would not enter into the war. Up until now, England had kind of hoped they could get involved, maybe provide some resources and break up the North and the South and cause some weakness to the United States. But at this point, if slavery was the main issue, England had a huge abolitionist movement. There was no way that they were going to accept the idea that they would support the South. Eventually, by the time we get out to 1865, Ulysses S. Grant's troops have not only fulfilled the Anaconda strategy, they overwhelm Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, and that ends the war, which then leads us into Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is really important for this time period because Reconstruction really is that failure to bring the country together and provide racial justice. Okay, now remember that during the war, the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln had passed a number of policies to centralize government power. They did that with creating a new national bank for the time period, providing investments to railroads, and also providing homestead acts, or basically incentives for people to go out and settle in the West. They were trying to create a market economy. The Republicans also passed 3 major amendments to the Constitution: the 13th Amendment, ending slavery; the 14th Amendment, which was meant to be an equal protection of people regardless of race; and then the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Now, the problem was, after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, there was a fight that happened between Andrew Johnson and the Republicans. Remember, Andrew Johnson comes from Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln had made him his vice president in 1864 to win that election. Johnson was an outright racist. He believed in uniting the country, but he was an outright racist. Johnson, on a number of occasions, for example, vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of that time period. And that eventually led to a fight between the Republicans and Andrew Johnson, in which Andrew Johnson was impeached from office over something called the Tenure Act, where Johnson was supposed to get approval by the Congress in order to hire or fire people from his cabinet. He was not removed from office, but they came 1 vote shy of being able to do that in the Senate. Even though Johnson wins that battle, he really loses overall the power of the presidency, and because of that, the radical Republicans now gain control, and they are going to attempt to reconstruct the South. How do they attempt to do this? They establish 5 military districts in which they take over the South, and then try to enforce the South to abide by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There was a huge increase in black voting at that time period, and the federal government funded the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a black-run organization with the hopes of providing local education and local voter registration drives. The other big thing that was done at this time period was the idea of 40 acres and a mule. So there was an experiment done off of the South Carolina islands to provide African Americans with their own land and to see if that would help them to do well. Okay, well, the South gets around all of this. How do they do that? Well, number one, they start providing for literacy tests. Literacy tests were provided on a justification that how can you vote if you can't read, but really these tests were a sham. The tests oftentimes are just tricky tests that were meant to make it extremely difficult for African Americans to vote. They were also expected to pay poll taxes. Now, this was given to both poor whites and poor blacks. But at that time period, black people had an incredible lack of resources since they had just been freed from slavery. So it just put another obstacle on top of them for voting. In some states like Mississippi, there was a grandfather clause. The idea that your grandfather had to have voted for you to vote showed loyalty to the country. Well, of course, this is ridiculous, considering that African Americans had been in slavery for the last 150 years. But probably the most important was the creation of sharecropping. So when African Americans were freed, they had no land, they had no resources. They were just given their freedom with nothing else. And so they had to find a way to make a living. And so the way they would do this is to rent land from white people in the South. Well, the white people in the South blamed African Americans for the Civil War, so they gave huge rents to African Americans and then would ladle them with debt. Now, to end all of this, of course, there was a military aspect or a violent aspect. The KKK was created to make sure that anything African Americans did to fight against this would be squelched with violence. Now, there was an attempt by the federal government to put this down. There were a number of acts passed where the federal government tried to make sure that the KKK would not gain power. But after a while, they just basically gave up. And the best example of that is in 1875. So in 1875 and 1876, we have the national election between Republicans and Democrats. There is unclear ballots that come back in 1876 about that particular election. And so because of that, the Republicans and Democrats went behind closed doors and made a deal. And that particular deal, the deal of 1877, basically said at that point, look, we'll give up on having Reconstruction in the South if the Republicans can end up winning the national election. So in that particular election, Rutherford B. Hayes was running for the presidency. Samuel Tilden was running for the Democratic Party. Rutherford B. Hayes gets the presidency, but the Republicans agree to end Reconstruction. That really ends the ability for African Americans at this point to be able to get equality. Of course, the Supreme Court also puts their seal of approval on this sort of inequality that's happened. How did they do that? Remember from class, a few cases that are really important. Number one, the slaughterhouse cases. Slaughterhouse cases had nothing to do with race whatsoever. Slaughterhouse cases had to do with local chicken farms and whether or not the Congress could regulate those, and the Supreme Court decides no, you can't, because we're not talking about production crossing state lines. The only area the Congress, have power over is over the national highways that are sort of under congressional approval. Well, for that time period, what are national highways? They're rivers. And why does that matter? Because it gets applied to the racial issue. And the argument was the only way you can regulate on racial equality is if somebody lives on a river. Well, good luck on that one, right? The other one is the Pacific Railroad case. In this particular case, the Supreme Court said the 14th Amendment says that everybody has to be treated equally, and a corporation is like a person. So therefore, you cannot tax them more. Well, why is that important? Because it changes the emphasis of the 14th Amendment away from race, which was its initial intention, towards the issue of economics. The most important case, of course, that comes out of this is in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. There, a man named Plessy is driving through a train through the South. He's forced onto one of the back cars of the train, and the argument being that he is African American. Now, I know this is going to sound crazy, but Plessy actually was about 1/16 African American. Why does that even matter? Because this was actually done within these southern states. They would actually make these criteria in which they would say, you're a quarter black, an eighth black, 16th black. And the idea was if you had any ounce of black blood that somehow made you unequal. That was how strict and absolute these sort of racial hierarchies were. Eventually, the Supreme Court comes to the decision that what equal means within the 14th Amendment is separate but equal. Meaning as long as the conditions are equal, we can separate people out. Well, of course, we know from there on out, things were never equal within the South as they were separate. But it even brings up that question, why do we have to separate people in the first place? This is obviously an attempt to recreate the Southern racial hierarchy of slavery. And by the time we get out to the 1890s, that has been recreated for African Americans. Okay, what are our big takeaways here? Number one, the country had an opportunity to unite around compromise, but the South decided to secede, creating an enforced unity by the time we get to the end of the Civil War. Number two, the Civil War led to the South's failure due to a lack of industrialization and a lack of European involvement. That's going to be really important because the South is really not going to even come back economically until the 1860s when they finally start to industrialize and start to take off. And then number three, Reconstruction initially was working. We do have a lot of evidence African Americans were coming out to vote. There were a number of African Americans elected to local legislatures, but the South would eventually undermine that in its attempt to create a new slave republic. And if you think about it, we've been dealing with the effects of that ever since. Okay, see you in class.